I'm discussing a philosophy seminar here at Stanford. Elijah Millgram, he's a professor at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, and he spoke about personal identity. What I thought was most interesting about it is actually the practical application of Milgram's philosophy. I read a little bit about Millgram. He actually even states on his website and in the documentation about his work that he believes that philosophy, like literature, is moving more towards practical, mundane usage, away from, let's say, more idealistic types of thinking way back, let's say, during the Homer times. So anyway, I think that's very refreshing, and he has also, I think, a very sharp and witty language that he's using. Just as a side note, also, I was actually surprised to see his age. He looks much younger than he is, so it looks like he's probably somebody that keeps himself very fit, and you can see that also in his mind. It's a very sharp, very, I think, naturally gifted mind. So, but back to the point. So, personal identity. So, I think, like, it's pretty, it's philosophy, right? So let's not be pinned down on very subjective interpretations of what he's saying. But nevertheless, of course, I want to have a conversation about his talk. So I'm going to have to interpret and most importantly, define what I've heard in my own words and use my own inference, which is exactly the topic here. Personal identity is really a set of tools that help you do inference. And I think Milgram says in other works, for example, in his book, why Nietzsche didn't get his act together, that people throughout their lives actually change, and that is really a change in personality, a change in oneself. He started the talk with the question, what is oneself? Is it a physical existence? Like, for example, your social security number is tied to you, but the you is changing. And I hope most listeners have gone through that process. I don't know whatever your age is. If, let's say, you're in your 50s, I hope you're different than when you were in your 20s. The reason I say I hope is because, as Milgram says, you do change the way your set of rules and processes by which you do inference, in other words, by which you interpret the world, by which you figure out what to do given the external information that's thrown at you, that set is changing. And that set is changing because you're learning, meaning you're changing your internal structure, you're learning, you didn't know about math, and now you know math. You haven't read Steinbeck, now you read Steinbeck. You haven't read Moby Dick, now you read Moby Dick. You don't know who Abraham Lincoln was, now you know. So you're gonna probably, that's what Milgram says, you're gonna change yourself because your set of rules and interpretation tools is going to change. That's why I say I hope, because if that's not the case, that means you really haven't learned much. The other way you change, of course, is also by changing the external environment, okay? i.e., go travel, go read, go experience other things. Why? Because that's going to change the way you interpret the world. Okay, you've seen a slum in Rio, you're going to change your perspective on what it means to live in a slum versus if you just read about it or if you've never seen it before. So, again, here's a quote, the idea that we construe ourselves as selves as a way of enabling, in the first place, inferences, and in addition, figuring things out more generally. Okay, this is the fundamental idea of personal identity. Selves are intellectual artifacts. They facilitate our reasoning. Now, I could, like many times in philosophy, when I attend these philosophy seminars, it's really fascinating, because obviously my main focus is on robotics and AI and the demarcation line between human and machine. And philosophy is a really, really important subject to study what is human and what isn't. And particularly when you look at it from the perspective of a machine, it becomes even more exciting. Like, for example, there's a quote also here. If you think about how you'd equip creatures you were building to get along in hard to anticipate environments, you realize you'd want them to design and implement and then theorize about and reassess their own consistency regimes. This is the Robinson Crusoe robot of Sergey Levin right there, right? If I have a machine that wants to be able to go through the world and understand so-called edge cases and learn from, adapt in different environments and do this with an energy efficient way, I have to have a way to continuously reassess my own inference techniques. So sometimes I might choose to look for shade when the sun is very strong. But sometimes I might not. Maybe if I lack vitamin D, I might actually expose myself to the sun. I might have knowledge about this and do it. So I need to be able to flexibly readjust my strategies. And isn't this beautiful how the machine and the human here start sort of intermingling? There's another, this is a side, and I'm not going to talk about this today, but there is a PhD I was just starting to read by Shanyu Yao, who is kind of the author of Tree of Thought, Chain of Thought, all these ideas in LLMs, which really states that instead of training machines and have them sort of have a fixed type of inference and expose them to external events and then have them do inference, we could also change the internal structure, for example, with Tree of Thought or things like that, where you kind of guide the machine to go within its internal structure and do inference more intelligently. In other words, reasoning. So he's mentioning the fact that the internal structure can change as much as the external structure can change when agents are concerned. And this, of course, is tangentially related to Milgram's work. But let's get back to Milgram. So what I want to discuss here is really the thought of oneself as defined as a set of rules for inference. One of the biggest caveats that Millgram points out, which is the fact that we have lots of specializations. So I bring up the idea of zero knowledge proofs to solve that problem. And then also I want to discuss a little bit Douglas Hofstadter here and the self-reference of inference and learning. This is not even on podcast. It's October 5th, 2024. This is Krim Telco. For the year, we are up 22.4%. The market's up 20.4%. We're outperforming by 2%. The Orange Capital Partners podcast here, the Not Even Wrong podcast, is the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. So for new listeners, you might think, okay, why is this guy talking about philosophy? What does this have to do with the hedge fund business? And as we said many times before, we're in the knowledge creation business. That's really what we are. We just apply it to capital markets. That's how we make a living. But that's not even the point. We're as much in the knowledge creation business as any other human being. Actually, this is part of this particular discussion here, right? Well, what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be oneself? Well, it means to create a set of rules by which we can do inference, which is, just a fancy way to say knowledge creation. Now I'm going to dissect the word knowledge a little bit more, and the word thinking and the word creation and all of these things. But just to explain why we're doing this, there's really two reasons. One is we like to keep track of what we're actually doing, particularly when it comes to knowledge creation. It's a very complex field, lots of things to do, lots of things to read, lots of ideas to digest. So it's good to have a record of what we were thinking at what time, so we can kind of consolidate those things. And then, of course, also, hopefully, we can what we call do a bit of yoga for the mind, right? And what does that mean? It literally means the same way when we do yoga for the body, we open up channels, we relax muscles, we enable more mobility, the same way we hope, and we have evidence for that by doing several things in the knowledge creation business. What I mean with that is, of course, read books, go to presentations, read philosophical texts, go to conferences, talk to people, learn from all kinds of different ways, and then consolidate that into knowledge. This is really what helps fundamentally in the hedge fund business. I mean, Warren Buffett said it a long time ago. He said, read, read, read. And there's a good reason why he said that. I think it has to do with yoga for the mind and the ability to be flexible. But let's talk about Elijah Millgram. So again, I'm very happy with his work. I think I can't say that about many philosophers, but he is definitely one of the more interesting ones. I think as a personality, he's sharp, he's clear, he's applied, he is intellectual, and he's also very on down to earth. So he really has this, I think, really good way of, means and reasoning with a more general, more metaphysical approach towards philosophy. A great combination. So the question is, what is a personal identity? So the personal identity, it's the self. Here's a quote: "The self is a consistency requirement for inference." In other words, what we call a self is a set of rules and principles that allow for inference. If they change, inference changes. It's the internal structure of an intelligence that reacts to the external. Inference is what your internal structure comes up with when given an external stimulus. The self is when that internal structure has consistency. So let's dissect that a bit. First of all, Millgram is very, very focused on the self and the consistency. And I think what he means, I believe that's what he means. I didn't hear him say that explicitly, but every time that you come towards a paradox, an anomaly, an inconsistency, every time your inference doesn't make sense to you, that's when you change yourself, because you have to reassess your own consistency requirement. And this is very akin to actually something I was thinking about recently, which is that generally paradoxes are cognitive fuel for people, right? For example, sciences leap forward when they're facing a paradox, the Fermi paradox, the quantum entanglement paradox, the Schrödinger cat paradox, and so on and so forth. All these paradoxes, they really show the science the limits and then help the science move forward. So the same applies to a human. So a self evolves whenever an inconsistency is observed. So for example, when my inference, I guess the way, if I want to come up with an example, is if my inference is that it's always good to take a walk on a nice, day on a beach, because that's healthy. And then there's an inconsistency, which is I feel bad sometimes when I do this and my body is not strong and so on and so forth. That's an inconsistency, and I reassess my own inference, and maybe I learned that maybe exposure to the sun is not so good for me. So I start changing my inference. Now, of course, this is a long way to say that I'm going to change myself, but a lot of these micro events end up changing the way who I am, and who I am is the way I conduct inference, and that inference is influenced by what by my internal structure, but what I choose to focus on and what I choose to learn. And this is a very important point. I actually sent an email to Professor Millgram. He hasn't answered yet, but I'm curious to know, how do we choose what to learn? Because what we learn is fundamentally influencing our inference, right? It is a different, and somebody once said that the choice of the undergrad at university is really a reflection of one's worldview. So if I want to study physics, I see the world as a sort of collection of mathematically explainable natural phenomena. If I choose to study poli-sci, I see the world as a sort of more of a human action, social environment type world. If I choose economics, I see the world as it's all about skin in the game and allocation of scarce resources, so on and so forth. So the oneself, again, is fundamental in many ways. First and foremost, it helps me do inference. It's also very important to understand that the oneself, sort of in the nature of Austrian economics, also means that the individual is the ultimate unit of decision making. It's not the collective, it's the individual, and the individual chooses to make those decisions by developing a oneself, and the oneself is a set of rules for inference. And this begets the question, okay, is there a circular reference here? Because what I choose to learn is what defines my inference, and the way I infer things is what I choose to learn, right? How is that? I think there's definitely a sort of a Gödel Escher Bachian loop here that we have to observe, and that potentially this could be driven by serendipity, by geography, where I live, by circumstances, by things like wars and pandemics. So there's a lot of things that could move this needle, and that's definitely an open question. Professor Milligram talks about specialization, which to me brought up a really interesting concept of the zero knowledge proof. Let me first explain his concern and then sort of have a broader application of zero knowledge proof. So the concern of Professor Millgram is that in a world where there's more and more specialization, in other words, knowledge that is not privy to me, that's what specialization means. I'm good at something, I don't really understand anything else. So how can I make inference about other things? In other words, if Dr. Fauci tells me that the pandemic is whatever it is, and I have to do whatever he tells me to do, how am I even able to infer for my own, how am I able to create my own self? So what's going to happen is what we're going to see herd mentality. I'm just going to follow the crowd. If somebody tells me to buy stock A because it's going to go up and I'm not a specialist in the financial markets, crowd mentality, right? So he's kind of questioning the oneself in a highly specialized world. And that's a very, very valid point. Just look at where we are today, and social media even accentuates this. Now, my caveat is that I believe there is, and I think actually Professor Millgram talks about this. I think he uses a Yiddish word in one of his books where he talks about sort of the old grandma wisdom kind of thing. So there is old grandma wisdom. There is, I think people, no matter how specialized, let's say Fauci is, or some general in the military, and all these people who tell us what is and what isn't, we have a good instinct for what is and what isn't. And we know when things are wrong. We know when things are inconsistent. When people tell us we have to stay home, be locked down because there's some sort of virus out there, and we have an instinct that tells us, oh, it's not so bad. Why are they forcing me to do this? And then, some have it, some don't, but there's definitely people who have that instinct. And why do we call it instinct, right? It's inherent in somewhere inside of us. We don't even know exactly where it is, but it's there, and it's part of our inference process. It might not be part of the frontal cortex, but it's there. And Jonathan Haidt talks about this also in his Righteous Mind, that we just have a certain understanding of the world. But that understanding can change. This is what Milligram says. So he says understanding of the world can change, and that it changes, and that's what it means, that oneself. In his book, Why Couldn't Nietzsche Get His Act Together, he talks about the fact that Nietzsche's philosophy towards the end of his life started changing because his personality started changing, and he's kind of making the point that the way Nietzsche was doing inference is really through having different experiences and basically having different selves. Just as a side note, I find it also really refreshing how Eli Millgram looks at, let's say, he studies the meaning of life, and the way he does it is actually studying real lives. Now he's choosing philosophers, but my point is, lots of people do that, right? We like to read biographies or even novels, fictional novels, because we're really interested in life and the meaning of life. And the best way to understand the meaning of life is actually to study life. And the best way to study life is to study people's lives. And that's kind of again, this is just a side note. Again, it's a refreshing idea coming from a philosopher that you actually study something concrete in order to have metaphysical conclusions. Now I want to talk about the zero knowledge proof idea. What does that mean? So in cryptography, Zero knowledge proof is a technique, a mathematical technique to test whether something is true without knowing about it. And that's what zero knowledge proof means. For example, if you apply for a mortgage and they say, look, you have to have more than $1 million in your bank account, you can prove that that's the case without them knowing how much money you actually have. So things like that. And I think this concept is really applicable here in Milgram's concern about the sort of specialization of the world and the lack of oneself, because lack of knowledge could be solved with zero knowledge proofs. And I think instinct, human instinct, is actually a life hack for zero knowledge proof. That's why we call it instinct. Well, I met this guy yesterday and my gut just told me he's not the right guy for the job. That's a zero knowledge proof. I don't know much about him. I don't know much about whether he can do it. I'm not doing a Bayesian analysis here or some sort of Monte Carlo tree search, but there's a zero knowledge proof. I met this girl, I went on a date with this girl and I don't think it's going to work out. Zero knowledge proof. I mean, I really don't have much data here. It's not like I have the luxury to iterate, with 50 other girls and figure it out. Like I have to have, so zero knowledge proof, there's a hack, and that's what we call instinct. And the question, of course, is then how can we train that? Can we train our instincts? And I think the way we can train our instincts is by exposing ourselves to more and more situations and then listen to our gut, and then maybe fine-tune our gut to be better at the zero knowledge proof thing. So again, to summarize, very, very fruitful, very inspiring, like most of these philosophy seminars. Shout out to the Stanford philosophy department. Really, interesting conversations, interesting discussions. Obviously, sometimes a little over my head, but that's okay. That's okay. That's fine. I am still able to learn a lot. So I think oneself, a set of rules for inference changes with time, with the environment, with the way we learn to do inference. So there's an internal change, an external change. There's a circle reference here. And then there's a zero knowledge proof, which is our instinct. Our instincts are zero knowledge proofs, which help us guide ourselves in a world with more and more complexity. Thank you.